Thank you for joining me today. Oops. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I'm going to talk about implementing offline first functionalities in your application. And to add a small cherry on top of it, I'm going to also talk on how to implement this with web components. So first of all, my name is Mahdi. I work for Vaadin as a developer advocate and trainer. How many of you heard about Vaadin before? Wow. Okay, for the two people who didn't raise their hand, Vaadin is actually a UI framework for Java developers. I'm actually not going to talk about Vaadin today, but probably I would love to mention the companies that sent me here to speak about my research that I'm doing in my free time. So what I'm going to talk about is actually technology in general. So the screen that you are seeing right now probably is quite old, and many of you have seen it before. It's a comparison showing the number of users accessing websites from mobile versus accessing desktop. It exceeded those accessing from mobile devices in 2014 already. So that's very old news, and everyone knows that already. But the question that keeps me wondering all the time is how come people prefer to use mobile devices instead of desktop? Like when I'm judging myself, I'm having in my office a nice display. All the time I'm using editors like photo editors or IDE and software development. I cannot really develop on a mobile device, right? Can you? Like, you cannot write code and debug and start a debugging session on a mobile device. That's probably not an easy solution. So this keeps me wondering how people are interested to do their daily life and have most of their time from mobile devices. And moreover, in my office, I have high-speed internet connectivity. So also, this is what keeps me wonder, because in mobile, you cannot rely on internet connectivity all the time. And I found out the answer. Actually, the answer is because myself and probably most of you are content producers. And here, content producer, I don't mean a person who writes articles or writes Word documents all the time, but any person who produces web applications, who produces mobile applications, who produces videos, photos, and so on. All those kind of people are 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute. Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, so all those kind of people are categorized as content producers. And those people, as I mentioned earlier, including myself, most of the time we need this kind of device. We need a laptop. We need a powerful PC. We need a powerful setup to be able to do our daily productivity. We cannot really do those kind of things on mobile devices or tablets. But the question is, when you are developing your next web application or mobile application, who you want to target? Don't do like us. We are at Vaadin, we are targeting developers. That's why we are targeting only this orange portion of the circle. But most probably when you are developing your web application, you want to target the blue portion. You want to target wider audience. You need to put in your mind that your audience don't really care about the latest trends in technology. They don't care about having the latest processor, the most powerful PC, the most powerful setup to be able to do their stuff. They just want something that works, that is convenient to use on daily basis. They don't want to hold this all the time to be able to tweet. They find that tweeting from here is way easier and more convenient. So those are the fundamental things or the motivation behind why I'm interested in offline first and why I'm interested in talking about how to implement or design your applications to be offline first. So let's just take it from another angle. So if we talk like 10 years ago or even more, we've been struggling to convince people that development should not happen on cloud anymore. Should not happen on desktop anymore and should move to the cloud. And luckily nowadays we don't need to do this homework anymore. Everyone now understands the benefits of developing for cloud, the benefits of having everything up and running on a cloud because it's more accessible, it's more up to date. You don't need to worry about downloading an installer and frequently updating, asking users to update their software and hacking and cracking software and those kind of things. So cloud is now kind of obvious for all people almost. And the next thing that is happening right now is also to make the mobile strategy for development is obvious as well. So people need to know that when they are developing applications, if you want to access the biggest number of audience, if you want to access everyone, then most likely you want to make it for mobile. Big companies made strategies and approaches on how to develop this. This chart is shown from HP. They are making a quick comparison between two famous approaches. The first approach is to do the normal development, which is develop a website for desktop. And then later on, squeeze the screen, add responsive, remove something, add more thing to make it look good on tablet. And then when you want to make it look good on mobile devices, you need to increase performance, think about what's really needed to be displayed on a very small screen, remove unneeded things, enhance the menu, and so on. So even though the first impression of getting a website is quite easy and straightforward, but after that you will need a lot of work and a lot of modifications to make it look nice on touch or handheld devices. That's why the other approach might sound like way better, which is basically you develop on mobile first strategy. You develop a website that is for the mobile device. You think all the time that is going to be used on mobile. Once it's usable from mobile, then it's automatically usable from tablet and desktop. You don't need extra work. So the amount of development needed to get your website up and running on mobile is the final work needed to get your website final and publicly available. Later on, you might think about adding extra features for people accessing from desktop. That's a good and nice to have, but this is not going to be a blocker for you from having your first iteration of your website or mobile app. So that's basically the strategy that many companies are following nowadays. And I have my own practical test that I like to follow. Basically, it says that how to know that you are doing things right. First of all, make sure that you are following a mobile-first design. So it means that all the time, you are testing on a mobile device. You are putting things together and testing if it's working on a mobile device or not. And then you automatically have things good. The second strategy is touch-first design. So also consider that your user is accessing your website from a touch interface. He doesn't have a cursor. He doesn't have a mouse. A mouse usually can access very specific pixels, but a thumb cannot. And finally, the last test that I came up with, which is called coffee first design. This is something I came up with, which means that basically you give your tester the mobile that has your app on one hand and the coffee on the second hand. And test if he will be able to do everything without dropping the cup of coffee. So basically, like think about it like that. I have another version of this, basically. Can you give your tester the application and ask him to drive at the same time? Like driving the car and using the application. So basically, think about it. Yeah, but it got censored in the, I cannot say that, right? But I just stated, but anyway. So think about it like that. Can everything in your application be accessible from one thumb? I don't need to do anything from the second hand at all. I don't need to zoom. I don't need to click and then, oh, I clicked on the wrong link or I clicked on the wrong text or something like that. Do I need to like come closer to see what's going on? Do I need to do something with the second hand or second finger? If you need any of that, then there is some way to improve your app. There are some things are missing. Otherwise, if everything is accessible and the cup of coffee didn't drop or no accident happened, then you are good to go. All right, so let's get started then. So that was basically the motivation. And as I hinted probably, I'm going to talk about mobile first design. And in mobile first design, there is actually many topics. But today, I'm interested more to talk about the offline first design related to mobile first. I cannot really cover everything related on how to develop a mobile first experience. I will just pick one of my favorites, which is offline first. Why offline first? So the reason why I am more interested in offline first, because it's the way to guarantee 100% always on user experience for your users. If your user go to the subway, fly, go away from the router if you have a router at home and then leave the range of the router, go somewhere that doesn't have internet, travel to another city or another country, all of those kind of factors, will they prevent your user from using your application or not? If you have an offline first strategy, then most of those problems are taken care of. All right, so before I go into how to implement offline first design, I will also quickly mention how to do that with web components. So since we are talking about the latest trends in technology and having modern application, then it's maybe worth also doing it with the latest technology, which is web components. And here comes a new question for you. How many of you heard about web components before? Awesome. Okay, I have good up-to-date audience, which is a great thing. So for those of you who didn't hear about web components before, very quick recap. What is web components? Basically, it's a new standard that is probably taking over now the HTML web. I'm not talking about any specific language. I'm just talking about the HTML itself. And it consists of 4 principles: templating, shadow DOM, HTML imports, and custom elements. Very quickly, what those means? It means that basically you start an HTML file and you write the template of how your component should look like. Just a template that consists of some divs and some span, some input elements, and so on. Maybe some style, and so on. And then this HTML file that you created, or the template that you created, you can import it inside the main application. So that's called HTML import. That's also a new standard that allows you to import a template inside the main application. And you give it a custom tag name. So it's not going to be a span anymore. It's not going to be input anymore, but you can give it your own custom tag name. The only rule for the name is that it must consist of a hyphen in the middle. So it can be my template or my component, or for example, x-component or something like that. So it has to have a hyphen in the middle. And finally, when it's rendered in the browser, it's rendered as something called shadow DOM, which is basically, instead of rendering everything that you see here inside the HTML code, it's going to be very brief and not showing all the details. So the custom component or the custom tags that you have just implemented will appear as a custom tag as well. There are advanced options in most of the browsers called show shadow root and show shadow DOM. That's helpful maybe for development time, but normally your user will not get all those things when he opens the source code. And it turned out that this kind of thing actually existed long time ago. So the video HTML tag, when it was invented in HTML5 and browsers started to support it, it was actually a custom element. So if you open it in the browser and then click on Show Shadow DOM, you will figure out that it consists of a bunch of divs, spans, input elements, and so on. You can try it right now, for example, on Facebook video or maybe YouTube if it's using HTML5. Basically, it's a custom element that browser vendors were implementing behind the scene, and luckily today it's time for developers also to develop their own components. We thought the same. So we thought that having web components brings a lot of benefits for the user and a lot of benefits for software developers. As you can see, it's bringing somehow kind of object-oriented thoughts and functionalities to the HTML web. That's why we thought about implementing something similar to our components. As of December 2016, those are the browsers that fully support web components. Firefox partially supported. Safari, we heard that they are going to put a lot of effort in it, and it should be supported by end of the year. And Internet Explorer, well, you know, it's Internet Explorer, right? But yeah, let's hope that those guys are going to work on this soon. Otherwise, Google actually came up with something called Polyfill, which is a layer that you add in the browser that basically fixes the gap between web component standards and the browsers that does not support it yet. Basically, you create a web component based on Polymer, which is, any of you heard about Polymer before? Okay, awesome. Awesome, that's a big number because I normally don't see that many people. Usually people, like, for those who've heard about Polymer, how many of you heard also about Angular and using it, are using Angular? Okay, for those who've heard about Polymer and are using Angular, would you keep using Angular or would you prefer Polymer? Okay, okay, for those who are with Angular, please raise your hand. Okay, okay, and Polymer? Okay, that's maybe 50% of those who raise their hands, but of course, they are not like a big thing to compare. This is a platform or framework for developing applications, and Polymer is just components, web components, a library of web components. But the interesting thing about Polymer is that, first of all, it's following the latest standard of web components. So that's something that is missing in Angular right now.
Angular 2 follows the latest standard of web components as well. And eventually they will merge.
I think in Angular 4, but not 2 into.
5, 6, I don't know.
Yeah, it's going to be in Angular 4, but Angular 2 actually decided that they will not add web components, unfortunately. Otherwise, it will be like, okay, if you can use any web component, then you can use Polymer components as well. The second interesting thing about it is that Polymer make it possible right now to use those latest standards in the browser as of right now. We decided also to create open source components to test out how people like them. It turned out that people really like our components. So the story is, we used to be a Java framework for Java people. How many of you are Java people? Okay. Okay, I'll stop talking then because, okay. So we used to be a Java framework for Java people to develop UI with Java and so on, but we got a lot of demand that people like our components, but they don't want to necessarily use it with Java. That's why we experimented this. We experimented to export the components and make them Polymer-based web components, make them the latest standard available. And people like them. They are all open source, and we made them available for Angular. So even though Angular 2, as of right now, does not support web components, we made the bridge to make them available for Angular, Polymer, React, and basically, in theory, any framework. And we made them also available for Java people. So, of course, our already existing users and our already community are more also interested in using them in Java as well. All right. So now I talked about two different things. I talked about offline first, developing an offline first application And this is the strategies that I believe we should follow. And then I talked about web components. Let's put them together and start to see what is the possible solutions that we can have. We can actually get offline support by using maybe caching. So basically cache the whole web page inside the browser, and that's it. Solution solved, problem solved, and that's it. Caching, yes. Good point, thank you. Well, yeah. So, yeah, I'm not talking here about money, just to be clear. But, yeah, thank you for pointing this out. So, caching. No, don't take a picture of that. Okay. So, caching. Again. So caching, we can basically just cache the web page in the browser. Problem solved, right? Actually, no. Yes, why? Who said no? Yes.
Because some data are dynamically generated.
Exactly, exactly. So you have a table, for example, you have a combo box, and those values are loaded from the database. You cannot just cache the combo box itself. You need to also cache the data in it. What if you have multiple forms? For example, when I click on this tab, it opens a form and fill it with some data. But when I navigate to the next tab, then I need to fill completely different data based on some combinations. So that's basically a very basic database interaction, and caching the elements only is not really interesting to see only components that are empty. That's why maybe offline storage is one of the most interesting solutions in here. So the most famous solution for offline storage is actually IndexedDB. You basically take a copy of your database, save it in the browser in an IndexedDB, and problem solved. Well, not really, because also sometimes your user will start to modify the data. So you just saved a copy of the data, but in read-only mode. What if I saved the data in my mobile, and then I went offline, but I thought I'm still online and start to make modifications, and then I clicked save, and then I went back online. All my modifications will be gone. Maybe this is not very good. That's why you might need some kind of strategy of data replication, so that modifications happening locally in the IndexedDB in the browser gets updated again to the server. One of the solutions available for data replication is Firebase. So Firebase, a little bit 1 year ago, I think, actually, yeah, 1 year ago, Firebase was a completely independent solution available. Less than 1 year ago, Google acquired Firebase, and they started to announce that it's now saving your data in Google servers, which is not scary at all. But but yeah, even though Firebase, I would have to say that Firebase is a very interesting solution. It has some constraints. So the first constraint is the server must be Google server, of course, and must be a Firebase server. So you must implement your own mechanism to migrate your existing applications to Firebase. They must be Firebase based. Or if you are developing a new application, then you must develop them with Firebase. You cannot just get MySQL database or Oracle database or whichever database you prefer to have. So the second limitation, or maybe not limitation, but Firebase also is a commercial solution. So you cannot just have it open source and freely available. It's something that you have to purchase and you have to pay Google on a subscription basis. So for maybe some enterprises, this might be a good solution, but what interests me today is to explore the open source internet one more time and see if we have other alternative solutions. Luckily there is, otherwise I'm not gonna be here, right? It's PouchDB. So anyone heard about PouchDB before? Okay, awesome. PouchDB. PouchDB is actually an Apache 2.0 solution that works with the so-called Apache CouchDB protocol. If you have any kind of database and you implement the CouchDB protocol, this red couch thingy, you just implement it on top of your database, then out of the box, PouchDB will work. And what it does exactly is continuously data replication of whatever happening on the server to the browser. So that when your mobile device or your web application is trying to accessing the data, it's not gonna access the data from the server directly, but it's gonna go over the PouchDB plugin. And then if your internet goes off, then the data will still be available and everything will still work. PouchDB will still serve your data and will still allow you to make modifications and updates to your data. And again, if you go back online, then the data will be automatically replicated to the server and everything will work just fine. So I have a demo today for you on I have an interesting demo for you today to show how I'm going to do that. I don't know, where is it? Yeah, here we go. So this demo is basically going to show you how to start using web components with PouchDB and how to apply an offline first strategy. In most cases, as I explained at the beginning, it's maybe way better to implement the offline first strategy from day one. So you are starting a new application, put in your mind that it's gonna be offline all the time, tested offline, and then it will automatically work online, which is great success. But what I'm going to show you now is that I'm going to assume that I already have an application up and running, and I want to migrate it to make it work offline as well. So I started here by having a CouchDB. This is my locally installed CouchDB thingy. And it's serving me some databases and it's mirroring some documents for me. And I have the solutions that I'm going to show you available fully open source on GitHub. So if this interests you, please go ahead and follow this project. It's AMahdy/offline-first-app. I'm going to post here everything related and any updates that I come up with. All right. If you also open the commits of the code, you'll find that it contains basically the steps that I've done to implement the offline first functionalities. So you can see that I have an initial thing and then added HTML, added fetch data, and so on. I have expanded those commits here over those tabs. So instead of live coding, I know that following coding might not work most of the time, especially when developing an application from A to Z. So probably I'm going to just show you the diffs, the differences of each commit, what I've modified, what I've added, and so on. And then let's test out the progress of the application. So my first commit is basically adding a Vaadin grid with lazy loading from Vaadin data server. This part is probably a little bit big commit, but nothing really exciting here except that I'm adding a Vaadin grid web component and I am binding it with a lazy loading mechanism from a back-end server. So I have here a function called getJSON that connects with demo.vaadin.com/demo data and so on. This is basically a web service that is providing me with the data. And it's performing lazy loading, which means that whenever I scroll, it starts to load more data from the server. And you can see it up and running here. So nothing really interesting here. As you can see, there is this small spinner, which shows that whenever I scroll, more data is getting fetched. Oh, let's scroll quite a little bit fast. Yeah. Like, this is one of the moments that I wish to have a slower internet so that I can demo things. But yeah, I hope you have seen the spinner, which shows that I am fetching the data from the server. Again, this is a data grid. Nothing fancy at this point, but I will just assume that this is how my application look like. Actually, I'm going to also add an editor since we talked that we want to make this data modifiable. So I'm going to do the second step, which is add simple HTML editor for my grid. So I defined a variable here. Is the font clear back then? Should I increase the font? No? Okay. So I defined a variable called selected, which is going to store the selected item that I select from the grid. And then here, when the grid is selected, when there is an item selected in the grid, basically I populate those 3 inputs with the value of selected. And finally, I have here a method called update. That is basically when it's called, it updates the variable called selected. And here is the HTML editor. Very, very simple thing, table with first name, which is an input field, last name, input field, email, input field. And then when I click on update button, it calls the update function. And as I said earlier, update function doesn't do anything except updating the variable selected. So let's see how it looks like. Here we go. So again, I click here, the form gets updated. The form gets updated with the values of my selection. And then if I make a modification, like let's call it Voxed, and click update, nothing happened. Can somebody tell me why? Yes, I didn't do anything actually. I just updated a variable called selected, but I didn't do anything with this variable. So eventually, this is a variable that I want to store in the database, or I want to send back a response to this database and request it to be updated. But at this point, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to move forward and try to get offline functionality. So, the first step is basically fetching the data from a CouchDB instead of a Vaadin data server. So up till this point, I was fetching the data from my remote server. So I will replace this with the PouchDB plugin. Adding the PouchDB plugin can be using Bower, using NPM, or here for simplicity, I'm going to just add it using inclusion, direct inclusion. So the first magical line, I'm defining a variable called remoteDB equals new PouchDB, and then I'm giving it the URL of my CouchDB. So this is the URL where my CouchDB is serving the protocol that is converting my actual database to a CouchDB enabled database. And as you can see, I'm getting rid of the getJSON, and instead I'm loading the data manually using the remoteDB variable. So remoteDB, this is basically the API of PouchDB. This is how to do it. You call remoteDB.allDocs, then like when it's finished, when it's okay, everything is okay, then load the grid. I had to make some conversion to convert from the data that I received from PouchDB into a data that grid can understand. And then this is the lazy loading part. So whenever I scroll in the grid, it requests some more data from the remote database. And that's it. So I removed the getJSON method at all. I'm not going to do anything related to online interaction at all. I'm going to try to fetch the data from my remote database. If I go back here one step, you can take a look at this kind of data. It starts with Carl, Emily, Aiden, and so on. But this data actually is completely different. Well, a little bit different. Let's load it one more time. Yes. So this is the data that is loaded inside my local installation of CouchDB instead of internet. And as you can see, it's basically loading the data very, very quickly because I have an installation that is available locally. And at this point, I didn't make anything related to modifications. So when I click on an item, nothing will happen, of course. Right? So all I did at this point is basically, instead of fetching from a server, fetching from my CouchDB installation. And this is all because of this magical line that I mentioned, which is remote DB equal new PouchDB. Any question at this point?
There's a conflict between PouchDB and PouchDB.
Yes, I'm going to talk about this, yes. Thank you. All right, the step after this is actually take the offline strategy in use. So I don't want to load the data from a remote database anymore. I want to start loading it from my offline storage. And this is the second magical line that we are going to see today. It's called replicate. So I've defined another variable called localDB, and this time I'm not giving it a protocol or HTTP address at all. I'm just giving it a name, local underscore take lunch, or local underscore the database name, or any database names that you would like to give. So basically, this is going to be my local storage pointer. And then the second line, PouchDB.replicate, which means that please replicate the data from remote database to local database. And then removing all instances of remote DB and replacing them with local DB. So in practice, what will happen? What will happen is if you are accessing this from the first time ever, then the local DB will have a replication of the data that is given from the remote database. And then moving forward, anytime I try to scroll in the grid, anytime I try to do anything, it will be retrieved using the local DB variable instead of remote database. So basically, at this point, if I went offline, everything should still work, isn't it? Let's give it a try. So I think, again, I don't have anything to show at this point. So if I select something here, still loaded here, update doesn't work. But there is something interesting that I really can demonstrate at this point. Any clues what I can do? Yes? So now the data is actually stored inside the browser. So it means that if my server went totally offline, this data should still be loaded, right? Can we test that? How can I test that? Do you think? I don't agree. Yes, any more thoughts? So I am not actually serving the data from any servers. I'm serving it from this guy. Yes. So if I shut down this is actually going to be my testing point. So if I terminate CouchDB, and for double checking, now it's completely gone. Was it this one? Yes. This is a demo that if I refresh this page, let's hope that data gets loaded. Yes, it works. Good. Okay, so data is still available. Lazy loading still works. Whenever I scroll, data is still getting loaded more and more, even though I don't have a server running. Again, I didn't turn off wireless at this point because it's useless, right? What I am interested in is turning off the CouchDB, the guy who is serving my data. I don't have any single interaction with the outer web at this point at all. Okay, the step after that is to start actually modification. So at this point, what I'm doing is read only. My data is saved on the browser, and I'm reading it. But we discussed that, yes. So we discussed that probably we want also to be able to modify the data so that when the user goes back online, the modifications get loaded. And this is what I'm going to do here. Let me expand this. Yeah. So this is the update function, remember, from the beginning? The update function that I told you, it doesn't do anything. What I'm going to do is basically call my local DB variable and then put the selected variable. As simple as that. So the selected variable contains the modification that has happened to my local, my selection. So I just push it inside the local database. at this time, I was trying to refresh also the grid so that the variables gets updated in the grid, but unfortunately it will not work, and let's see why later. So let's test only the first part. So I'm refreshing just to make sure that I have the latest snapshot of the data, and let's, for example, change Madeline, first name, let's make it Voxed, and then update. And as I said, the grid didn't do anything because there is a problem in my code, but I hope that if I refresh, then her name gets updated. Remember that CouchDB is offline, so nothing happened at this point. I'm not relying on any data coming from anywhere outside. I'm updating the data offline, okay? And this reminds me of an important point, how to put the data back to the server. And here comes the third magical line of the day, which is sync. So PouchDB.sync, instead of replicate, is going to synchronize my data from local DB to remote DB out of the box. All is magic, nothing that I need to do myself at this point. To be able to test at this point, so this is the latest snapshot. To be able to test at this point, I need to put my CouchDB back online to be able to see if the modification is going to be seen there or not. So I open CouchDB, and let's make sure that I have the latest snapshot of the data. Let's modify Mil as first name to make it Voxed again. Nothing here, I have to refresh. Yes, it's saved. If I go back to, yeah, it's a bug. It's a bug, I will discuss this, yes. So let's open the data. Actually, I'm using a database called Vaden, and I believe that it's this one, yes. So it got updated, even though I didn't update myself the database, right? Okay, so at this point, I probably have managed to make the whole life cycle of offline storage. I have one single point that is called remote DB that is connected with my remote CouchDB. And then everything else in my application should be connected to my local DB variable, so that I am sure that everything loaded in the application is reading from my offline storage, not from my online storage. If we go back to my presentation, we talked that we need to have replication all the time from the PouchDB to the CouchDB, and then if the connection goes offline, then it's gonna read from my PouchDB. So at this point, I'm guaranteed that everything is loaded from my PouchDB, my local storage. Let's add even more functionalities. So PouchDB actually comes with extra functionalities, plugins that you can have for many things that can pop into your head. One of the things is actually querying the database. What if I want to search in the database by like a select query or something like that? So here I'm going to show you how I added the find plugin to see how very simple it is. First of all, I included as a script. It's called pouchdb.find.js, and then here, I added one extra line to define what is my index that I want to search based on it. So I said that I want to be able to query this database based on first name. And finally, here I created a new button called find. When you click on this button, it reads the value that you want to find and query the local database. So it searches that with the selector that has first name equals query, then basically it pumps or it dumps the selection, all the users that matches my selection to the screen. Very simple, straightforward. Again, I'm trying to keep it very simple, and then later we can have it look nicer. So let's test this out. So let's make one more modification. Milla, let's call her Voxed again. Update. Grid doesn't update, but if I search for Voxed and click find, then I'll find the 3 records that have first name called Voxed. Similarly, you can add plenty of other plugins that can serve your needs. At this point, the only thing that is missing is basically why it was not updating the grid. And it turned out that I made a mistake, actually, which is that I was trying to refresh the grid without also updating the revision. So how CouchDB actually works is that it keeps a revision of all my modifications. So I have the original value, and then I modified this value. It has a revision to the old value, and there is a new revision given for the new value. And the grid was trying to fetch the older revision. If we go back to CouchDB, we'll find here that there is a variable called rev, and it says 8, which means that this specific record was modified 8 times. Of course, this number is not standard. You cannot rely on it, but more or less, it gives me a hint that this record was modified 8 times. This record was modified 2, 4, and so on. So here, for example, no, we didn't modify this today. Maybe this one. Yeah, so this, for example, was modified 4 times. So to fix this problem, all I had to do is basically also update the revision in the selected. Give it one more variable or one more parameter, give it the latest revision. Right? And at this point, it worked. But instead of showing you this app, I'm going to show you actually the modified version of the app. I hope this looks a little bit better. As you can see, it's now loading all the data as modified. It has everything. It works offline. If I select this, it gets loaded here. I can change the name and say update, and then the record gets updated. And then I can search, for example, and click find. Well, yeah, this is still not fixed. I need to find a better way to represent the search results other than dumping it to the screen. But yeah, this is basically what I wanted to see. And in this demo, what I focused on is to make sure that I'm using fully web components. So no more HTML editor, no more these bad things. I'm using here Polymer input, and here paper button, and here this is Vaadin splitter. So fully web components at this point. If you are interested, this is also the code. So it's slightly different than what I presented, but I thought that the presentation is easier to do with more familiar code that is just JavaScript. But now that you know how things work, probably you will find that everything is familiar. I have here a variable called remote database. It's new PouchDB, and a variable called local database. And then a function. When it's ready, like at the beginning, I'm making sync, and I'm adding more parameters like making live and retry, those parameters that you can have. And then I'm indexing by first name, defining the columns of my grid. And then this is basically the fetching part. So if I fail to get from remote database, I try to get from local database. And then this is the update function. So basically updating, and here local db.put, so pushing to my local database. And finally, this is a find plugin, which is basically query the data, or queries is selected based on first name. So more or less familiar name. This source code that I'm showing you right now is exclusive for you. Is this like good title? This source code actually is not published yet on GitHub. I'm going to publish it one day within this week. Not this week, I mean next week. Well, I don't want to give a specific day because, as you can see, I still have typos like cache and those kind of things. But as you can see, this is basically the source code, the reference for everything I mentioned today. This is the promised final application after I push my latest modifications. To be honest, exactly what I want to push before pushing the source code, I want to divide them into steps again so that I make them easy for people to read and follow what exactly I've done to the application. One more thing, if this sounds interesting for you, I have also another project called Java PWA, which is basically how to get a progressive web app in a Java application or in an application basically. So I have published all those steps. So here you can see the steps. This is the difference basically between the first app. This is how the app looked like when it was loading in a browser, and it was very small font and not occupying the full screen. And this is after applying PWA concepts. I have here a theme color. I have here no address bar and so on. Those are the steps. And the app is actually available on the home screen, so you can actually click on the icon. It opens a splash screen, and it's standalone app. It's available as a standalone app. So this is probably the next step after you get offline first functionalities to actually have even more advanced options. Am I running out of time? Seems so. Okay. So just before I leave, I have a very quick summary for you. So what are the challenges that you may face when you are developing this? The initial load time. So I kind of cheated in my application because I was just loading everything in the database to the client side, which is probably not practical. This is not really what you want to do. Probably your database can be maybe 1 gigabyte or maybe 1 terabyte of data, and you don't really want your user to wait till 1 terabyte is loaded, given that he has 1 terabyte of storage in his mobile device. So this is really a big topic. This is how to architect your CouchDB to understand what really need to be loaded for this specific user and what need to be deleted because this specific user doesn't need anymore. So this is something that you probably need to take into consideration when you are developing such apps. You don't want to dump a relational database with a lot of tables and a lot of queries to the user. And here comes also an interesting thing, which is security. So now you are giving your user all your data. So how secure it is. We have two parts of this. The first part is what the browser will promise me. Browser vendors promise not to reveal the data under different domains. So let's assume that I made an application under example.com and I downloaded the data to the browser. And then some other person is opening from facebook.com. Can Facebook read data stored by example.com? They can't. So that's a promise from browser vendors. But the other part is, what if someone else opens your laptop when you are not on it, when you are not in front of the laptop, and then open examples.com, and then open the inspector of the browser and start to write query to query your database. He will be able to see everything, right? That's why you need to implement some kind of authentication so that the data is not decrypted except if the session is open. Of course, this same user can see your Facebook messages, can see your emails, right? But what if you are signed out? Then you should not allow this user to read the data if you are signed out. Same thing happens if you are opening from a public computer. So once he clicks sign out, you need to make sure that either this data is completely destroyed or at least not accessible by other users. And third point, which was raised previously here, it's the race condition. So what if here is a scenario. I open the website and start to make modification to a form, and he opens also the same website and start to make modification to the same form. I go offline, but he is still online, and he made the modifications, but I'm still working and still making my modifications. I'm offline, right? And then I clicked save when I'm offline. After a few hours, when I got back online, I'm trying to push my modifications locally, even though he already pushed his modifications right away online. So which modifications will be taken into consideration? Actually, the answer to this is the same answer that you would implement in any normal database. So In all databases, the race condition does exist. The only difference that we have here is that it's probably more common to happen. In live databases, if two people open the same form at the same time, the first person to click save is the first person to actually save his data, and the second person will get an error. Otherwise, you will implement some kind of mechanism to merge the data, right? So that's happening in real databases already. So what would you do in real databases if this is a critical problem you would implement here as well? Otherwise, as I said, this is probably a very common problem that will arise in your application. Luckily, PouchDB has a strategy called the best guess strategy. A best guess, which is going to see, okay, maybe he modified the first name and I modified the last name. Why not merge both of them? If he can do that, he will merge. Otherwise, it will raise a conflict, and then you can manage this as well. And again, I would refer that to your architecture, how to architect a race condition in a database. So I have all the links that I mentioned previously. This is the open source project. If you would love to see the updates and the progress on what I'm doing in this project, please follow this link. Otherwise, there is also this article showing my steps that I've done to create progressive web apps in Java application or any similar applications. I don't know if I still have time to get questions, so I think it's easier if someone wants to ask me, maybe we can go. Do I still have time? No? Yes? What time is it? Okay, let's do it that way. I'm going to be available outside if somebody would love to ask me any question. Please be my guest. Thank you for listening and enjoy the conference.